Vanessa Crowley smiled as the wall of Grant Mercer's century-old barn collapsed into smoke and splintered timber. "Your barn is gone forever," the HOA president said, certain her forged safety order had erased the last obstacle to her luxury development. Grant did not argue. He photographed the bulldozers, collected a blackened iron hinge, and waited for the county inspector to arrive. What Vanessa had destroyed was not just a barn. It was a protected historic structure, a working agricultural facility, and the anchor of an easement her entire neighborhood depended on. In court, one document turned her victory into ruin. Stay to the end because Karen's smile disappears when the judge reveals who must personally pay the $6 million rebuild bill. Grant Mercer owned more than 40 acres of land, pressed right up against the polished lawns of Briar Glen, a community he had never joined and never needed to. At the center of his property stood a wooden barn raised in 1891, its beams cut and joined by hands that had vanished from the earth generations ago. It was not some forgotten relic left to rot. Grant used it every day, storing reclaimed lumber, antique farm machinery, land records, and architectural salvage pieces worth far more than most people guessed. County records listed it as a protected historic structure, one built with hand-joined timber framing, once serving as a supply depot for farms across the region, sitting along a documented historic service road and holding architectural and commercial value that could not simply be replaced. One morning, Grant found a red notice stapled to his gate, and it was not a friendly one. The notice claimed the barn was structurally unsafe, that it violated Briar Glen's aesthetic standards, that it was lowering surrounding property values, and that it needed to be torn down within 14 days. Beneath the warning sat the signature of Vanessa Crowley alongside a seal that looked at a glance disturbingly close to an official county stamp. Grant recognized the problem immediately. Because the Homeowners Association had no legal authority whatsoever over land outside its boundary. He drove to the county office that same afternoon only to learn the lead inspector was traveling and unreachable for days. Vanessa did not wait for him to find another path. That very evening she arrived at his property with Marla Whitcomb at her side, and 2 HOA security officers trailing behind, demanding he sign what she called a voluntary demolition agreement. Vanessa described the barn as a rotting eyesore, dragging down the whole area. And when Grant asked why an association with no jurisdiction over his land cared so much about a structure that was not theirs to control, she answered that Briar Glen was simply protecting community value. Grant refused to sign anything. Before she left, Vanessa turned toward the open field behind the barn, studied it for a long moment, and told him that someday he would thank her for clearing it away. Something in her tone told Grant this was never really about appearances at all. Later that week, he pulled county planning filings and discovered that a developer named Derek Halston had submitted plans for a massive event center worth tens of millions of dollars positioned right beside Briar Glen. The most convenient access road for that project ran directly through the exact spot where Grant's barn stood. 2 months before the demolition, Derek had already approached Grant with an offer to buy a strip of land cutting straight across the farm, pitching it as nothing more than a temporary maintenance road, though the price offered was far below what the land was worth. Grant turned it down since the route would have sliced through his working area and destroyed the natural drainage system that kept the whole property functional. Days later, Vanessa returned with a second offer, promising to waive any future disputes, build him a brand new metal barn hand over extra cash if he demolished the old structure voluntarily, and even grant him access to Briar Glen's private utilities. Grant refused again, explaining that the barn carried historic value that no prefabricated replacement could ever restore, and Vanessa mocked him for clinging to the past. What followed was not a single confrontation, but a slow campaign of pressure that unfolded over weeks. Supply trucks were suddenly blocked at the Briar Glen gate despite holding shared access. Rights, noise, complaints poured into the county with no real basis. Misleading contamination. Warning signs appeared near his property line. Anonymous. Letters told his clients his facility was about to shut down. And an insurance company he had used for years suddenly demanded a fresh structural inspection out of nowhere. Grant documented every single incident without confronting anyone directly, installing additional cameras around the farm and backing up every legal record to a secure off-site system. At a Briar Glen meeting, Vanessa told residents that Grant was standing in the way of a community improvement project, carefully leaving out her financial relationship with Derek. In truth, she had already signed a private agreement entitling her to a cut of the event center's profits, contingent entirely on clearing that access corridor. Marla knew something was happening, but had only ever seen a summary of the arrangement, and Vanessa assured her they would force Grant into a sale long before the project became public knowledge. Grant eventually sent a formal letter demanding the HOA cease all interference with his property, and his attorney Nora Bellamy made it unmistakably clear that any coercive action taken on his land could constitute trespassing, fraud, and conspiracy to seize property. Vanessa received the letter and simply ignored it, telling Derek that Grant apparently believed a single lawyer's letter could save his barn. Derek warned her not to move until the paperwork was actually valid, and Vanessa assured him the documentation was already handled. That confidence would prove to be the first crack in her plan, though nobody could see it yet. One night, Grant's cameras caught a man in a Briar Glen jacket quietly measuring the ground around the barn's foundation just before midnight. Grant sent the footage straight to Nora, who traced the man back to a contractor who worked regularly for Derek Halston, and together they requested written confirmation from the county that no demolition order existed. The response came back unambiguous. There was no new structural inspection on file, no scheduled hearing regarding the barn, no emergency order of any kind, and the barn remained officially listed as a protected historic structure requiring preservation. Grant locked the confirmation letter in a fireproof safe and forwarded a digital copy to Nora for safekeeping. While he secured his defenses, Vanessa was busy manufacturing an offense, pulling an old inspection report from an unrelated property, altering the address, and rewriting the conclusion to fit her purpose. She lifted Caleb Rawlins's signature from a public document and used it to fabricate an emergency demolition order out of thin air. The forged order cited a collapsing roof, dangerously flammable materials inside an immediate threat to nearby residents, and the need for demolition without any advance notice whatsoever. Vanessa hired a demolition crew from an entirely different county to avoid anyone local recognizing her scheme. She told the workers that Grant had already lost control of the property through a court order, that the HOA was acting under official county authority, that the owner might resist, so speed was essential, and that the entire job needed to be finished within a single day. When one contractor insisted on verifying the permit directly, Vanessa handed him a phone number connected to someone posing as a county employee. Marla grew uneasy and asked why they were not simply waiting for a legitimate order to arrive through proper channels. Vanessa's answer was chillingly simple. Once the barn vanished, she said Grant would have nothing left to negotiate with, and the principle of an irreversible outcome would force him into accepting a payout. The night before the planned demolition, Grant left the farm to deliver a restored timber frame to a client more than 2 hours away, a trip Vanessa knew about in detail because one of Derek's employees had been tracking his truck for weeks. At 5:40 in the morning, a convoy of demolition vehicles rolled through the gate. The footage captured everything in unforgiving detail, showing Vanessa unlocking the gate with a duplicated key, Marla standing nearby, glancing repeatedly at her phone, an excavator rolling toward the barn structure, workers stripping the historic preservation marker off the front wall, and Vanessa herself ordering the crew to start before sunrise fully broke. One worker paused when he noticed the historic warning sign still bolted to the barn, but Vanessa insisted the marking was no longer valid. When he hesitated further, she threatened to cancel the contract and sue his company directly, and the excavator's arm swung forward into the first wall. At that exact moment, Grant's phone lit up with a motion alert, and when he opened the live camera feed from the road, he watched the roof of his barn beginning to buckle in real time. He turned the truck around immediately, but instead of racing home to confront Vanessa, he made a different set of calls, entirely contacting the county sheriff, Caleb Rawlins, Nora Bellamy, the State Historic Preservation Office, his insurance provider, and an independent evidence collection specialist who had worked with him before. By the time Grant arrived back at the farm, more than half the barn had already been flattened. Antique timber machinery and salvaged inventory lay crushed beneath the excavator's treads, and smoke rose from a pile of sawdust where sparks from a metal cutter had caught. Vanessa stood beside her SUV, wearing sunglasses and holding a coffee cup, as if she were watching a routine construction project rather than an act of destruction. Grant demanded the crew stop immediately, and Vanessa held up the forged order, insisting she was protecting the community from a genuine danger. When Grant asked whether she understood the property sat entirely outside Briar Glen's authority, she told him that boundaries on paper meant nothing when community safety was at stake. A statement Nora would later replay for a judge, more than once. Grant pointed toward the preservation marker lying discarded in the mud, and Vanessa simply looked at him and said the words she believed would end the matter for good. "Your barn is gone forever," she told him, expecting anger, expecting a scene, expecting him to give her a reason to call the police herself. Instead, Grant remained perfectly calm, pulling out his phone and documenting license plates, timestamps on the machinery, the position of shattered timber components, the forged order still in her hand, hydraulic fluid leaking into the ground, and items workers were carrying out of the wreckage. He picked up a scorched iron hinge from the rubble and placed it carefully into an evidence bag, while Vanessa laughed, telling him he was collecting garbage. Grant only replied that he hoped she still had the original copy of that order somewhere safe. Within minutes, Caleb Rawlins arrived on scene, examined the paperwork Vanessa handed him, and delivered the news that shattered her confidence in an instant. He had never signed the document in her hand. The permit number did not exist anywhere in county records. The seal was formatted incorrectly, and no emergency had ever been reported through proper channels. Caleb ordered the demolition halted immediately, and sheriff's deputies sealed off the area within minutes. Vanessa's composure cracked, and she quickly tried blaming the entire situation on Derek, claiming she believed the paperwork he provided was legitimate. The problem was that the surveillance footage showed something very different, capturing the moment Vanessa herself physically handed the forged permit to the demolition crew leader. As the dust settled, Grant discovered just how much had actually been lost that morning, and the list was longer than anyone expected. A set of antique chestnut beams, an industrial wood planer, the original survey maps of metal filing, safe timber already promised to paying clients, and salvage pieces reserved for a historic train station, restoration, were all gone, or badly damaged. Vanessa still believed her insurance would cover the fallout, and that the whole matter would settle quietly as a private civil dispute between neighbors. She had no idea how wrong that assumption would turn out to be. As the crew cleared debris away from the exposed foundation, Caleb noticed something catching the morning light, a bronze plaque half buried in dirt that identified the barn as a structure permanently protected under a federal preservation agreement. It was the first sign that Vanessa had destroyed something far bigger than she ever imagined. Nora moved quickly to secure an emergency court order, preventing the HOA from moving any additional materials, destroying related records, finalizing the contract between Vanessa and Derek, or blocking expert access to the site, while also locking down every camera file, email, and phone record connected to the case. Silas Boone, an architectural historian with decades of preservation experience, arrived to assess what remained of the barn, and quickly identified 3 distinct layers of value that made this far more than an ordinary outbuilding. The first was architectural. Since the barn relied on a rare mortise and tenon timber frame that never used modern steel fasteners, with several beams cut from American chestnut wood that had become nearly extinct in commercial construction, meaning any accurate reconstruction would require sourcing salvaged timber from structures of the same era. The second layer was legal, rooted in a 1974 preservation agreement the previous landowner had signed with the county, requiring anyone who unlawfully destroyed the structure to rebuild it in its original form use equivalent. Materials hire, certified craftsmen restore the surrounding landscape and compensate for any resulting business losses. The third layer was operational, since the barn functioned as a working facility generating real revenue, and its destruction meant Grant lost active contracts, lost storage capacity, was forced to rent temporary space, faced compensation. Demands from his own clients, lost specialized equipment outright, and endured months of business disruption that could not simply be undone. Silas estimated that building a basic replacement metal structure would cost only a few $100,000, but accurately reconstructing the historic barn under the preservation agreement could exceed $5 million once every requirement was factored in. Add the cost of remediating leaked oil, restoring the original stone foundation, sourcing period-accurate salvaged timber, hiring structural engineers, paying skilled craftsmen for hand-joined framing, installing discrete modern fire suppression systems, properly storing recovered materials, and compensating for lost business income, and the total climbed towards $6 million before the case had even reached a courtroom. Vanessa called the figure absurd the moment she heard it publicly, accusing Grant of trying to turn a pile of rotten wood into a treasure chest. The HOA sent residents a letter suggesting Grant was attempting to steal money from the entire community, and Vanessa called an emergency meeting demanding an increase in dues to cover mounting legal fees. Some residents, however, were starting to ask uncomfortable questions of their own. They wanted to know why the HOA had destroyed property outside its own boundary, who had actually approved hiring the demolition contractor, whether the board had ever voted on the decision, whether Vanessa possessed authority to sign contracts unilaterally, and why Derek Halston's name kept appearing throughout internal emails nobody could fully explain. Marla began to panic as the questions piled up around her, and she reached out privately to Nora, though she was not yet ready to testify against her own board president. Around the same time, Nora obtained a copy of a deleted email, in which Vanessa had written directly to Derek, stating plainly that once the barn disappeared, Mercer would have nothing left to negotiate with. It was the first hard evidence connecting the destruction to a calculated financial motive, rather than any genuine safety concern. From that point forward, the case stopped looking like a neighborhood dispute and started looking like a coordinated conspiracy. The formal lawsuit that followed listed trespassing, intentional property destruction, permit fraud, forgery of a public official's signature, interference with business operations, destruction of a legally protected structure, conspiracy to seize land access rights, and a demand for punitive damages, on top of everything else. Vanessa hired an expensive legal team using funds pulled from the HOA's own reserve account and built her defense around 3 separate arguments meant to shield her from personal responsibility. Her first claim was that she genuinely believed the barn posed a collapse risk and had acted in good faith to protect residents, a story Nora dismantled, using structural reports confirming the barn's stability pre-demolition, photographs, emails, proving Vanessa knew no inspection had ever occurred, and video of her personally pressuring the crew to move faster. Her second claim tried to shift all blame onto Derek, insisting he had supplied every piece of paperwork involved. But forensic data showed the forged documents were created on a laptop registered to the HOA under Vanessa's own user account, with metadata still bearing her initials, buried in the file history. Her third claim insisted the entire board had approved the demolition together, supported by meeting minutes that fell apart under scrutiny, the moment Nora examined them closely. The fonts within the document did not match one listed attendee, was verifiably out of state on the meeting date. The file's creation timestamp postdated the supposed meeting entirely. Marla's signature appeared only as an inserted image rather than an original mark, and there was no audio, recording, or valid meeting notice anywhere on file. Marla realized at that point that Vanessa intended to make the rest of the board carry the blame for something only she had orchestrated, and she agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for having her own civil liability evaluated separately and fairly. She handed Nora a trove of evidence, including text messages, where Vanessa ordered emails, deleted a draft profit-sharing agreement with Derek, a private recording from an internal meeting, invoices for the unauthorized contractor, photograph of Vanessa practicing Caleb's signature, and a list of suspicious payments routed through HOA accounts. In the recording, Vanessa's voice came through with chilling clarity, stating that once the demolition was finished, no judge on earth could rebuild a building that had already been turned to sawdust. That single sentence became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case, proving the destruction had been deliberate and designed specifically to create an outcome nobody could reverse. Shortly after, the HOA's insurance provider refused to defend Vanessa against claims involving fraud and intentional destruction, meaning any coverage would apply only to accidental liability, leaving her personally exposed for anything tied to deliberate wrongdoing, while the HOA itself began considering legal action against her for acting far outside her authority. Vanessa continued telling residents that Grant would eventually cave and accept a lowball settlement, but when the offer of $650,000 arrived, Grant rejected it outright and insisted on full restoration under the terms of the original preservation agreement. While reviewing camera footage from the morning of the demolition, Nora noticed something that had been overlooked entirely: a truck leaving the property before deputies even arrived on scene, loaded with the metal filing safe that had gone missing from Grant's barn. The truck was registered to a company controlled by Derek Halston, turning what had looked like property destruction into something closer to a calculated land grab. Grant confirmed the missing safe had held original survey maps, road access records, the barn's preservation, certification, water system, documentation, several business contracts, and historical land transfer paperwork going back decades. Vanessa had insisted publicly that she had no idea the safe even existed, yet footage clearly showed her pointing directly at it moments before a worker loaded it onto the truck. Nora obtained a search warrant for Derek's storage facility, and investigators found the safe hidden behind a temporary wall, its lock cut clean through with several documents already removed and sitting inside Derek's own office. The most important document recovered was a 1968 easement map showing that Briar Glen relied on a stormwater drainage line running directly beneath Grant's property. That easement carried one critical condition requiring the land to remain used for agricultural and preservation purposes, meaning that any HOA interference or change in land use could give a court grounds to suspend the community's drainage rights entirely. Vanessa wanted that map gone because she understood something crucial: that Derek's event center project could never gain approval without a guaranteed drainage solution running through that same corridor. The full outline of her scheme finally came into focus, beginning with declaring the barn dangerous, then destroying it while Grant was away, then seizing the easement records, then pressuring Grant into selling the strip of land, then clearing access for Derek's development, then collecting a personal financial stake, and finally using the HOA itself as a shield against consequences. Once investigators closed in, Derek quickly began cooperating with prosecutors and shifted every ounce of blame onto Vanessa, handing over the secret profit-sharing agreement as proof. Under its terms, Vanessa stood to receive a consulting fee, a percentage of future event revenue ownership of a commercial unit inside the finished development, and a bonus payment if Grant sold his land below a predetermined price. With that agreement in hand, Vanessa could no longer claim she had acted purely out of concern for community safety. Grant returned to the cleared wreckage site once investigators finished their work searching quietly through the debris until he found a small carved mark burned into a surviving beam. That mark belonged to the craftsman who had built the barn more than a century earlier, a man whose name existed nowhere but in that single etching. Grant later told Nora he was not pursuing this case purely for money, explaining that the barn represented skill labor and history belonging to people who no longer had any way to defend their own work. He wanted Vanessa to understand that some things could not simply be erased because they stood in the way of profit. Before the trial began, Vanessa publicly claimed Grant was trying to force 240 households to pay $6 million over what she called just an old barn, and when Nora watched the recording, she remarked quietly that Vanessa had just handed them evidence of her own complete lack of remorse. The courtroom filled quickly on the first day of trial, packed with Briar Glen residents, local reporters, and preservation advocates who had followed the case for months. Vanessa arrived dressed in an expensive suit, trying hard to project the same confidence that had carried her through every confrontation before this one. Her attorney opened by describing the entire situation as an unfortunate administrative mistake, nothing more than a paperwork error that had spiraled out of control. Nora countered with a single sharp sentence telling the jury this was not a mistake at all but a business plan carried out with an excavator. Caleb Rollins took the stand first and confirmed everything. Investigators had already uncovered that his signature had been forged, that no demolition order ever existed, that Vanessa had once called his office, asking how to obtain an emergency order, and had been told she did not qualify, and that he had personally warned everyone involved not to touch the barn before any inspection took place. Nora presented phone records proving Vanessa had known the correct legal process the entire time and had chosen to bypass it anyway. The excavator operator testified next, describing how Vanessa relentlessly pressured the crew to move faster, specifically ordering them to demolish the front facade first, so the structure could never realistically be saved. He recalled her saying that once the roof came down, Mercer would have no choice but to sell. Marla took the stand after him and confirmed the full extent of Vanessa's deception, describing the falsified meeting minutes, the deleted emails, the unauthorized use of HOA funds, the promised cut of Derek's profits, and the plan to let the rest of the board absorb the blame. Vanessa's attorney tried painting Marla as an accomplice, desperately trying to save herself, but Marla openly admitted her own cowardice while still handing over the original recording that sealed the case. When that recording played through the courtroom speakers, Vanessa's own voice filled the silence, stating plainly that once the barn disappeared, history would disappear along with it. Silas Boone followed with a detailed walk through every element of the required restoration, proving that the nearly $6 million figure was not some imaginative estimate but a legally mandated cost built from real requirements. He outlined the need to source equivalent salvage materials, rebuild the frame using traditional joinery techniques, restore the foundation and drainage systems, recreate the exterior, accurately install modern safety systems without compromising the historic design, hire certified preservation specialists, and compensate for the extended loss of business income. When Vanessa's attorney asked why they could not simply construct a cheaper modern replacement, Silas answered without hesitation, explaining that the defendant had not destroyed an ordinary barn but a legally protected historic structure with binding restoration requirements attached to it. Vanessa herself took the stand shortly after, insisting once again that she had only ever wanted to protect her neighbors from danger. Nora presented the secret profit agreement between Vanessa and Derek, and Vanessa claimed her signature had somehow been copied without her knowledge. Nora then produced metadata, proving the very document had been sent directly from Vanessa's personal email account, and for the first time since the trial began, her composure finally started to slip. Nora placed the scorched iron hinge on the table directly in front of her, the same hinge Grant had pulled from the wreckage that first morning, and asked Vanessa a single pointed question about whether she remembered laughing when he picked it up. The courtroom went completely silent as she struggled to answer the weight of every earlier denial, now pressing directly against her. Nora used that hinge to tie Vanessa's own words back to the moment of destruction, playing footage where her voice rang out clearly across the property, declaring that the barn was gone forever, followed almost immediately by laughter as Grant lifted the burned piece of metal from the ground. Nora asked why someone supposedly responding to an emergency would react with amusement at another person's loss, and Vanessa weakly claimed she had simply been reacting to stress. Nora pressed forward, regardless, presenting celebratory text messages sent to Derek, photographs of Vanessa standing proudly in front of the wreckage, emails predicting Grant's inevitable surrender, public statements blaming the victim for the entire situation, evidence tied to the hidden safe, and the forged order created on HOA computer equipment. Vanessa finally lost her composure entirely and accused Grant of exploiting the situation purely to enrich himself prompting Judge Evelyn Barrett to immediately demand she control her tone inside the courtroom. Her attorney then argued that any financial responsibility should fall on the entire HOA collectively, since Vanessa had technically been acting in her role as president throughout the process. Nora rejected that argument point by point, explaining that Vanessa had acted entirely outside the scope of her authority, without a valid board vote, using forged documents, pursuing personal financial gain, deliberately destroying protected property, stealing evidence, hiding critical records, and deceiving both the board and the demolition contractor at every turn. Because of that, the standard liability protections typically extended to HOA officers simply could not apply to her conduct. Nora proposed a judgment covering the full cost of restoring the barn to its original condition, environmental remediation expenses, the value of lost equipment, and materials lost business income during the disruption, expert, and legal fees. Punitive damages a permanent ban preventing Vanessa from holding office in any homeowners association again, and referral of the forged documents to prosecutors for criminal review. The total restoration cost was calculated at $6 million, not including several additional categories of damage still under review. When it came time for closing statements, Grant kept his remarks brief and direct, saying he had no interest in punishing innocent residents for decisions made entirely by Vanessa. He asked the court to prioritize recovering funds from her personal assets, first from the profits promised by Derek from any hidden consulting accounts from her personal investment properties, from whatever remained of valid insurance, the coverage, and from anyone else directly involved in the conspiracy. Grant made clear his goal was restoration, not vengeance against an entire community that had simply been misled. That single statement shifted how many Briar Glen residents viewed him for the remainder of the trial. Judge Barrett studied Vanessa carefully before adjourning for deliberation, and reminded her that she had repeatedly claimed nobody could ever rebuild what she destroyed, and that the court was now prepared to answer that claim directly. When the judge returned to deliver her ruling, she stated plainly that Vanessa had acted deliberately with clear financial motive, without proper authority, relying on forged documentation, intending to create an outcome that could never be undone, actively working to conceal evidence afterward, and showing no meaningful remorse throughout the proceedings. The court acknowledged that the HOA bore some responsibility for its failure to maintain proper oversight of its own leadership. Still, the primary responsibility belonged squarely to Vanessa, since she had signed the contracts herself, forged the demolition order herself, ordered the destruction herself, accepted personal financial benefits, stole critical records, falsified meeting minutes, specifically to conceal her own actions. Judge Barrett ordered the creation of an independently supervised restoration fund, one required to rebuild the barn to its exact original dimensions, replicate its original roofline, restore its timber frame using traditional techniques, rebuild the original stone foundation source, historically equivalent materials, meet modern preservation standards, and complete the entire process under the direct supervision of Silas Boone alongside county officials. Then the judge announced the number everyone in the courtroom had been waiting to hear: $6 million allocated for full restoration and recovery of lost business operations. For a brief moment, Vanessa allowed herself a small smile, assuming the cost would somehow be spread across the entire community she had claimed to protect. Judge Barrett quickly made clear that assumption was wrong, stating that due to her fraud, personal profit motive, and deliberate destruction of property, Vanessa Crowley would be held personally liable for every portion of the cost not covered by valid insurance. Her smile vanished instantly as the full weight of the ruling settled over her. The court authorized seizure of her vacation property, 2 rental units she owned, her investment accounts, the consulting fees she had already collected from Derek, her projected share of the development's future profits, luxury vehicles, and other non-essential assets, and any funds routed through shell companies connected to the scheme. The event center project was suspended indefinitely, and Derek permanently lost access to the land corridor his entire plan had depended on. Vanessa's case was formally referred to prosecutors, who began reviewing charges related to document forgery, fraud, trespassing, theft of private records, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to unlawfully seize private property. She was ordered to step down from her position as HOA president immediately, and when she turned to look at the residents seated behind her, she found not a single supportive face left in the room. Marla and the remaining board members quickly passed a new set of internal safeguards meant to prevent anything like this from happening again, requiring public votes on any major contract, independent audits of all HOA records, a ban on using reserve funds to defend personal misconduct mandatory, legal verification for any dispute involving property outside HOA boundaries, and removing the president's ability to unilaterally hire contractors for forced action against anyone. In the weeks following the ruling, the fallout spread far beyond the courtroom walls, touching people who had once trusted Vanessa without question. Local news outlets picked up the story, and reporters descended on Briar Glen, asking residents how a homeowners association president had been allowed to forge a county official's signature and order the destruction of a federally protected structure. Some neighbors admitted on camera that they had signed petitions supporting Vanessa's so-called community improvement project without ever reading the fine print. Others confessed they had assumed the barn really was a hazard, since Vanessa had repeated that claim so often and so confidently that it simply became accepted as fact. The scandal forced a broader reckoning within the association, as residents began digging through years of old meeting minutes and financial statements looking for other irregularities they might have missed. What they found troubled them deeply. Vanessa had quietly redirected portions of the reserve fund toward private legal consultations months before the demolition even took place, long before any dispute with Grant had become public. She had also pushed through several unrelated contracts with companies that, upon closer inspection, shared officers and addresses with entities connected to Derek Halston. It became clear that the barn had never been an isolated incident, but rather the most visible piece of a much larger pattern of self-interested decision-making that had gone unchecked for years. Residents who had once dismissed complaints against Vanessa as overblown now wondered how many other decisions had been made for her benefit rather than theirs, and the association scheduled a series of open forums specifically to rebuild trust with the community she had spent so long manipulating. Derek Halston's cooperation with prosecutors bought him a reduced set of charges, but it did not save his reputation or his business. Investors who had committed early funding to the event center pulled out one by one once the fraud allegations became public, and the project was formally shelved before a single permit could be approved. The land Derek had hoped to develop sat fenced off and untouched, a visible reminder of how quickly an ambitious plan could collapse once its foundation turned out to be built on forged paperwork and stolen records. Grant occasionally drove past that empty lot on his way into town, and he never felt any satisfaction watching it sit idle. Only a quiet confirmation that the truth, however long it took to surface, tended to catch up with people, eventually. Marla's cooperation earned her a measure of leniency from prosecutors, though she still faced scrutiny for her initial silence and her failure to raise concerns before the demolition occurred. She used her remaining time on the board to push through the reforms that would prevent a repeat of what had happened, working closely with an independent auditor to review every financial decision the association had made over the previous 5 years. It was slow, uncomfortable work, and more than once she had to sit across from neighbors who wanted to know why she had not spoken up sooner. Marla never tried to excuse her. Hesitation only explained that fear of losing her position had kept her quiet for far too long, and that she intended to spend whatever time she had left on the board making sure no single person could ever wield that kind of unchecked power again. Grant, meanwhile, focused on the practical work of putting his business back together while the legal machinery ground forward in the background. He rented a temporary storage facility 2 counties over to house what remained of his salvaged inventory, driving back and forth several times a week to keep projects moving for clients who had waited patiently through the disruption. Some contracts had to be renegotiated, and a handful of clients understandably walked away, unwilling to wait out an uncertain timeline for materials that no longer existed. Grant absorbed those losses quietly, adding them to the growing list of damages. Nora would eventually present in court, but he never let the setbacks stop him from continuing the restoration work that had defined his career for over 2 decades. Silas Boone spent months tracking down salvageable chestnut timber from barns and mills scheduled for demolition in neighboring states, negotiating directly with owners who had no idea their old outbuildings held pieces of history that Grant's project desperately needed. He cataloged every beam, documented its provenance, and cross-referenced growth rings and joinery techniques to ensure whatever arrived on site would match the barn's original construction as closely as possible. It was meticulous, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely made headlines but mattered enormously to anyone who understood what true restoration actually required. Silas often reminded Grant that rebuilding a structure like this was not simply about replacing lost material, but about honoring the specific hands and specific decisions that had shaped the original barn more than a century earlier. 14 months later, a new barn began rising slowly from the same foundation where the old one had stood its shape, climbing back into the sky piece by piece. Silas managed to source reclaimed chestnut timber, recovered from 2 structures built during the same era, ensuring the restoration honored the original craftsmanship rather than approximating it. Grant personally restored the scorched hinge pulled from the wreckage months earlier, and mounted it back onto the barn's main door with his own hands. Inside, a small plaque was installed near the entrance, stating simply that the structure had been rebuilt by court order following its unlawful destruction. The framing crew Silas assembled worked with hand tools rather than modern power equipment wherever the preservation agreement required it, cutting mortise and tenon joints the same way the original builders had done more than 100 years earlier. Grant spent many of his evenings on site long after the paid crew had gone home, sanding down salvaged boards and matching grain patterns by lamplight, determined to have some part of his own hands in every section of the rebuild. Neighbors from Briar Glen occasionally stopped by to watch the progress, and a few even volunteered to help clear debris or haul lumber. A small but meaningful gesture, considering how many of them had once stood silently behind Vanessa without asking a single question. The restoration fund, overseen by the court, released payments in stages, each one requiring sign-off from both Silas and county officials before the next phase of construction could begin, ensuring no shortcuts were taken and no funds disappeared the way HOA money once had under Vanessa's control. Grant chose not to host any large celebration when the work was finally finished. He simply opened the doors, moved his equipment back inside, and returned to the work that had been interrupted for over a year. Several Briar Glen residents who had once believed Vanessa's version of events came forward privately to apologize for how they had treated him. Grant never asked them to take on blame that belonged only to her, requesting instead that the HOA finally learn to respect both boundaries and history moving forward. In the final scene, Grant stood in front of the fully restored barn as a county vehicle pulled up along the road nearby, and Caleb Rollins stepped out to take in the finished structure for the first time. "She said it was gone forever," Caleb remarked, studying the rebuilt frame with quiet admiration. Grant glanced at the old hinge, still holding firm on the freshly built door, and answered simply that she had not erased it at all. She had only made bringing it back far more expensive than she ever imagined. And behind him, the restored barn stood solid against the sky, while the empty lot meant for her development remained untouched and silent beside it.